I got to say, this is just a beautiful place to be, and appreciate being out here. My background, you know, from the academic standpoint, I stumbled into emergency management, went in right after graduate school, met one of my fellow students who had done an internship in emergency management in Wilmington, North Carolina, which is New Hanover, it's on the coast, and talked about emergency management. That's the first time I'd ever heard of it. He said, well, man, that sounds great. So I did the same internship, and then went to work with Georgia Emergency Management Agency and was helping them build a school safety program. And all of this was before Columbine, because Georgia ranked #1 in the nation for the most violent deaths in schools before Columbine occurred. They passed a Senate bill where we were told to go out and basically approve all of these plans for public schools based on a Senate bill that was passed, and then all that curriculum was transformed and thrown out nationwide as a result of Columbine. From there, I went through Hurricane Floyd, which was the nation's largest evacuation. It wasn't Katrina or Rita, it was actually Floyd, because Florida to Delaware evacuated at some point over a multi-day period. And then I interviewed with FEMA Region 4 on the morning of 9/11 and stuck with them through the 2004-2005 hurricane season. In 2006, I guess it was the beginning of 2007, I decided that I was tired of being at FEMA just from the standpoint of the political environment. I saw it at its best in 2004 when we managed 4 major hurricanes in 6 weeks, and then you're only as good as your weakest link, and our weakest link got hit in many places the next year, and the whole system, and I say we, as in the emergency management community, got hit. You know, and it was a complete and total breakdown, and literally after that, it was a very interesting place to be if you were in FEMA. After Katrina, it was a tough place to work. So I stepped out, went into the private sector for 6 months. I moved back home to North Carolina. Got a phone call from the state of Alabama. I was asked to be director of Alabama Emergency Management Agency, so I went there 4 years. During my time there, I went through 14 disasters, 8 of them were presidentials. I got BP, Deepwater Horizon oil spill, which I'm going to talk here a little bit. So it's not always like the public-private sector partnership. It's what do you do when the private sector is responsible and the FEMA and Homeland Security don't have a clue how to help you. From there, I stepped into the private sector about 5 years ago. I'm now Vice President of Hagerty. We do emergency management all over the country, largely recovery. But I currently serve as the private sector committee chair for the National Emergency Management Association. And so one of the things that's bothered me, we're going to talk about kind of the evolution of this, and from my standpoint, and I'm just one perspective, and I get that, so please, you know, feel free to call BS or whatever you want to do, as the other gentleman said in one of the other classes. I speak from my perspective and based on what my experiences have been and where I'm trying to push things to go from a way that I think is going to make our world a little bit better. But to me, and these are just some thoughts, it's no longer about what the private sector can do for government in disaster, okay? It's not what can Walmart bring to me, the local community, or to the state, or to whatever. It's becoming more of a mutually beneficial relationship and understanding how private sector works. And I spent 10 years in government before I stepped into the private sector, and I can tell you that my 10 years of being in government taught me nothing about how private business is run, organized, or has to react in different areas. And there's a major gap what's there. And I can't tell you, and I said this in another class, I've never sat in a class where anybody taught me how to train a community to generate sales tax revenue after the big earthquake and you've lost 80% of your infrastructure. How do you do that? Sometimes it's beyond emergency management's capability, and I think that we have to recognize that and call in the right people to be able to get business back up and running. And if it wasn't working before the disaster, then why are we rebuilding to that same standard and not utilizing the recovery funding that we have? And it's not just FEMA funding, it's 54 different types of disaster declaration dollars, from Chamber of Commerce, there's economic injury loans, there's SBA, there's HUD CDBG-DR, and if you don't know how to use those collectively for the greater good of during recovery as an emergency manager, you got a lot to learn, in my opinion. And there's ways of being able to look past public assistance and individual assistance and getting into it. So obviously, this relationship, it all started, in my opinion, as a result of, largely Katrina. Well, you know what, I back up. 2004 hurricanes, that's when we had such a push for commodities. There weren't enough MREs. There wasn't a bottle of water to be found, but you've had 4 major hurricanes in 6 weeks. I mean, everything that anybody had from a mutual aid standpoint, from a private contract standpoint, was gone. Now imagine that if that's major earthquake in major metropolitan areas, and it was, what can Walmart do for us? Can you give us water? Can you give us this or that? And Walmart for a while jumps into it and says, all right, and I'm using Walmart as a blanket stereotype, a big box. And they say, okay, yeah, that's fine, but at what point do we start selling this to generate sales tax revenue? You know, so that you can pay for these disasters in these communities and put people back to work. Louisiana was probably the first state, in my opinion, to really establish what was, you know, what now everybody is trying to set up is called business EOC concepts. And what happened in Louisiana is there's actually a disaster. Has anybody ever heard of the Community Disaster Loan Program? This is a FEMA program that was born after Katrina, and it says, you've been hit so hard, you can't generate sales tax revenues for 3 years to pay your bills as a government. And so this is a big, you know, multi-billion-dollar loan that actually the company I work for managed on behalf of Louisiana and Mississippi, and they started to understand that this is a major problem. Okay, we need to engage businesses, and the Louisiana Business EOC was basically born through partnership with LSU, and the original picture was basically to get an accurate picture of the total cost of critical infrastructure in business, linking businesses with appropriate, you know, organizations, and reducing the reliance on federal assistance. In Alabama, when I was director, we had 4 electoral college votes. That doesn't help you very much when you've got Florida to the right, you know, to the right, left or right of you, and Louisiana to the other, and there's a race for commodities. So you have to sit back and regardless of who's president, I don't care. You know, it's the commodities go where the electoral college votes are, particularly for the presidential election year. It's just the way it works. And the bottom line is that, you know, I think a lot of these EOC concepts were how do we get private sector to help us out in case I can't get access to the national logistics strategy or disaster logistics strategy. Where do I go to get supplies? And how does this work? Should I set up pre-event contracts? And a lot of this started to come out. You know, and then the benefits of maintaining the business EOC is, you know, largely it started to shift this emphasis of disaster supply chains away from free goods, you know, coming down from the federal government to what's the delicate balance of, you know, government handing out water rights and MREs to restoring the local economy and starting to generate that sales tax revenue and starting to get a picture. So they would call in all these business leaders into their EOC, they would run it. And then as we started to evolve into different disasters, that emphasis changed, which I'll get to in a minute. A lot of the EOCs, so now basically even FEMA has a national business EOC concept. Many states do. I don't know if Washington does or not.
No, we went another direction and went pretty well for us.
Good. You know, and basically what they were trying to do is if you're using emergency support functions as well, do you guys use emergency support functions or ANACES? But basically trying to tie it in largely to ESF 5, 7, and 14, long-term recovery, and this is where they were actually trying to funnel in their operations for business EOC. Then Sandy hits. In my opinion, Sandy, Superstorm Sandy, you don't call it Hurricane Sandy because it was actually a tropical storm. But Superstorm Sandy basically started to serve as a catalyst for a real change in the public-private sector market, and new ideas started to emerge from the grassroots that we hadn't thought about yet. And what happened is that you know, many businesses, you know, in these EOC concepts can't afford to put staff or overhead in your EOC for large portions of time. They much would rather prefer more virtual concepts of saying, what do you need? You know, what are the issues that you're seeing? Let's set up this virtual EOC concept, and I think that's more where you guys are headed as well. And so a lot of this is, how do we develop the right software to do rapid exchange with the businesses, and not just big box, but also understanding the impact to the small business, which makes up 90 to 95% of most of the smaller towns, big towns, and even in Seattle. I don't even know what the Seattle makeup is of small business, but I bet it's probably 90% or greater that makes up those environments. And how do we do rapid exchange to get information, and what's the platform that we're using? And then the other thing is that small business is critical business. So stop planning and trying to define what critical workforce is or critical business is. Now there's critical workforce for infrastructure, but then there's also why is Walmart more important than the other 95% of the small businesses that make up their community. And if you look at the Rockaways that were completely wiped out, 90% of the businesses there were classified as small, but in some cases we developed reentry plans that kept these small businesses out because they weren't deemed critical and couldn't apply for the process. And they don't have the capability to sustain a hit and be shut down for multiple days to where they can survive that long. And so a lot of times the policies, what we're finding is that our plans and our concepts or our safety and security is actually keeping small business from coming back online. Once a small business dies, or a generation-owned family business dies, it never comes back. And so it changes. And so, we've got to be really critical as to how long we're keeping them away, from some of these events. And then disaster recovery centers emerged. Instead of business EOCs, what emerged in New York were small businesses and downtown business organizations that are promoting the atmosphere of the small business started to develop their own DRC concepts similar to what we would do for individual assistance of here's the buffet line of assistance for you, disaster survivor. You don't qualify for this, you qualify for that. Well, what they're trying to do is set up basically disaster recovery center concepts for the business environment of saying, I need a cash register, I need drywall. By the way, I can open up my business, but I can't get an inspector to come tell me that it's okay to open. Can we get that inspection process waived through the governor's declaration or through a local emergency ordinance or whatever? You're preventing me from opening my doors. Or, and then they started other things here, basically trying to figure out where they could get supplies from and getting it in quicker and trying to reduce the downtime. Government waivers, that was the inspection process that just got in the way. Some of the public health stuff that goes in there, take a look at the laws and policies that businesses have to maintain under a blue sky day versus disaster, and what can be waived and forgiven until normalcy, a new normal is established. And then there were other ideas like I call it Operation Square. The Square Company hands out free squares to businesses where the power wasn't coming back on so that they could make financial transactions at their business even though MasterCard and everything else, the traditional lines, was not working. And then how do you get the signals out there? Where does private business get what we call CALs, or communications on wheels, to help them establish Wi-Fi signals and hotspots and that kind of thing? It's something that they need to be able to run. And it's just kind of thinking of how do we respond? Because in some of these areas, particularly the rural areas, the Walmart in some of these areas generates 10% of a county's sales tax revenue. 10%, which is a massive amount. So, it's actually thinking of what is government doing to support the reopening and, of business and reducing the downtime. Big business needs small business too. The other thing about the assistance that we provide in this country is, particularly to a small business or to you, the individual assistant applicant, is it comes in the form of a loan. And, Americans, their checkbooks are fouled up right now. And it's not getting fixed. It's getting worse every day, which drives the need for more disaster declarations, in my opinion. Put climate change in a box. We can have that argument some other time. But in my opinion, what's driving disaster declarations is I can't help myself, I need the government. And largely you can see that people don't have rainy day funds. And if they don't have a rainy day fund in their household, do they have a rainy day fund for their business that they manage, their small business? Probably not. And in some cases, the only form of assistance that comes is through a SBA loan. Well, if I'm struggling to keep my small business alive and I don't really have the capital in my small business to keep it running for 2 weeks of downtime when I've been shut out of my area or told I can't return, how am I ever going to take on a loan to keep that open and then also repay that loan? It's more debt. And so, you know, if you look at, you know, if there's any, you know, researchers in here or students, it'd be interesting to see how effective the SBA loan process actually is. You know, even down to the individual citizen that applies for an SBA loan, it's basically saying, I bought a house, I was underinsured or uninsured, and I don't know how that happens in this country, but the bottom line is that they've lost their house. They still have to pay off that mortgage, and an SBA comes in and says, well, here's a new loan, you know, despite the earthquake or the hurricane, that you also have to pay off. So they basically have two mortgages to pay off the same house, you know, once they rebuild it, and it's the same with business. And I'm wondering if it's time for us to rethink how assistance to businesses goes back, not saying that government should take care of everybody, but how do we change the assistance to help them out to more grant format? And so what happened is that some of the larger businesses actually recognize, like Citibank being headquartered, you know, or having major offices in some of these areas like the Rockaway, said, you know, it would stink for these businesses to go out. So they started doing their own $25,000 loans to the small businesses through a very simple and very quick process where the money was turned around very quickly so that they would stop the hemorrhaging and keep their doors open. So that the atmosphere that had been created by great people in these communities for years and years would be maintained. If you go back and look at New Orleans, you know, after Katrina, the small businesses that died were replaced by big chain businesses, and the environment's changed drastically. Even all the street music's organized now. It's not impromptu. You know, so there's a lot of stuff that goes in, and disaster actually changes your environment very much. So, need for more change. You know, do our plans and policies prevent businesses from coming back online quickly? You know, one of the biggest problems that I see is in evacuation planning, at least in the Southeast. We have these elaborate reentry plans that prevent people from coming back in. Sometimes I often ask the question of castle doctrine. If you're allowed to defend your house, how can government keep you away from it? You know, and in some cases, what about my business? You're telling me I'm not critical, or I'm not a certain size or whatever. In some cases, I think we've overthought reentry planning, that we're just going to secure the city and shut it down or whatever. What if we took a more simplistic approach and went the red, yellow, green concepts that said, you know, this area 911's not functioning to 100%, you're entering at your own risk, have at it, go fix your business. Yellow means some of the infrastructure might not be working, you might not have water or power yet, but 911's responding, and green is okay. You know, and really making things more simplistic rather than writing these big frameworks and guides that say this is how we're going to secure the city and do reentry. Now, I know that's pie in the sky and it doesn't work for everything, but how come? Why does it have to be so difficult is the question that I'm asking, and the question that a lot of businesses are asking. Next, this is the big question, and Wendy, you used to be at Microsoft, me and you, we're going to start a business, okay? Here's the problem. So big business, let's take the company OnStar. You know what OnStar does? GM cars, right? They collect data on you guys that drive their cars every day. They know your phone patterns, they know when you talk and drive, they know where you are, they know how fast you're going. Same with Jawbone. Has anybody seen people wake up after an earthquake? And how good all the people wake up because they've got data on your sleep patterns, and they're looking at maybe reverse technology of alerting you for, what is it, the 5 to 10, 15 second warning before the earthquake occurs. There's all kinds of data that's out there. And you, emergency manager, you want to know some of this stuff, you know, like particularly for evacuations. The OnStar data that they have is amazing. They can tell you if traffic's moving or if it's not, where the bottlenecks are. What if we could get OnStar's data down to the local police? And OnStar says, we're willing to share that data, you know, to a degree, but here's the problem. I'm not packaging it up for Seattle differently than I have to package the data up for the state, differently than I have to package it up for the state of California versus Washington. You give me the framework, one framework, I'll send you the data, you figure out how to use it. I don't think emergency management's being innovative and thinking like that, and it's trying to understand how do we collect this data and use it, and not collect secret data or whatever else. It's more of, are people in a refuge of last resort situation in New Orleans? Is the water rising and they're still stuck in traffic on the roads? How do we, you know, reverse that and say we got to make different traffic, changes to our traffic patterns and get these lights green and run traffic control here or there. And that's just one area. Whoever can solve the data sharing compatibility problem and get big businesses an easy way to dump their data down to you guys at different levels of government and different departments to where it's easy for you to go in like an iTunes application to click and choose what you want to listen to or hear or whatever else, it's going to be a wealthy person. Because that's their biggest need is everybody calls a big business and says, hey, we need to use your data or we need your help. They don't have time to package it in your format to meet your EOC. Not all contractors are evil. One of the things that's left out in the private sector are consulting firms like us. And I can tell you that right now FEMA is reorganizing, going through another reorganization of recovery. The private sector has not been invited to that conversation. And there are people in the private sector, I know a guy that's on my team that's managing $12.5 billion to fix the city of New York. And it's coming from FEMA, it's coming from HUD, it's coming from post-disaster mitigation, it's coming from all over, has a team of 85 people managing this funding, spent 23 years inside FEMA, and people like that aren't at the table. There are ways of helping government understand what contracts you need in place to supplement your lack of staff when you go through budget cuts, the proper way of doing contracts rather than putting out RFPs that keep people from going after them because of the language that's in there, or there's barriers to entry. There's all kinds of things that are there. There are propeller head contractors that do work, and then there are consultants. There's a big difference. Don't be afraid to bring the consultant to the table. So what does business need from government? LSU, Stevenson Disaster Management Institute. I am stealing their survey that they did of businesses. Pat Santos is a former director of Louisiana's Office of Homeland Security and Emergency Preparedness. They did this study of 1,000 businesses. They had 236 respondents. They grouped them, they grouped the businesses into critical infrastructure, key resource type industry businesses. Maybe it was oil and gas, crude oil, who knows what it was. And then general business from all over the perspective, small, large, whatever. And so they went through a series of trying to figure out what it is that we need to be able to help them with, rather than saying, how can you help me? And it says, one, do you know your parish emergency management director? Half, basically said yes, no, not sure is probably no. If they don't know that answer, to me, that's probably a no question. But only half said they could name it. That's important. If the parish EMA is responsible for issuing warning order communication, protective action communication, only half the businesses know, then citizens just don't know where to go for the right information on how to heed the right warning anyway, much less how to get information on whether or not the business works or not. When did you last interact with your office, parish emergency management, 27% never, 11% not sure, more than a year ago, 6 to 12 months ago, less than a month ago, 17%. And this is the critical infrastructure. This is pulled out for critical infrastructure key resources. You can see that there's a little bit more than 17%. Still, there's a lot of important industry that basically doesn't talk to emergency management on a regular basis. The problem is government's meeting private sector after the bomb goes off, after the earthquake happens, after the hurricane hits. We're not meeting together on a regular basis and staying in front of each other on a regular basis. When did your organization last participate in emergency planning or training with your local emergency management office? Not sure, never, more than a year ago. It's pretty interesting. And this is for the critical infrastructure folks, right? And then finally, this one's interesting. In regards to your business, how concerned are you about the following on a scale of 1 to 5, 5 being most concerned, 1 not being so concerned? I find it interesting that the two that rank the least are, I need somebody to help me with an emergency operations plan or my business continuity plan. So most of the focus is, we got to get businesses to understand business continuity. They're not worried about that. A lot of these businesses have, a lot of the larger businesses, critical infrastructure businesses, have continuity of operations plans and know what they're doing. What they want to know is, how long are you going to keep me out of town by your reentry planning? How do I receive situational awareness and emergency alerts to know that we're in trouble and when we need to move? It's not, don't feed me more be ready campaign garbage. I want to know what the policies are. I want to know what's going on here and how I can get resources in and out without getting stopped at the border. Okay, because I'm going to have other parts of my company, other companies coming in that support our company. What's a major company? Gulfstream's a major company in Georgia. You know how many companies support Gulfstream to build jets in Savannah, Georgia? Probably 100. So how do you get them into those communities to get the largest employer in Savannah, Chatham County back up and running? And if you don't have all that worked out, their suppliers to get them back up and running are stopped. And it creates problems. So what are the changing things? Meaningful inclusion in the private sector. We actually went through and redesigned a public awareness campaign in Chicago, Cook County called Gear Up, Get Ready. And the whole premise was, what are the low to no cost things people can do to be more prepared? Even down to getting, schools don't have the ability to hire school safety resource officers. How do you invite police officers to have lunch in the cafeteria on a regular basis, be seen in a non-response mode to fix some of the negative images of each other? Always seeing police officers coming in and arresting or taking care of a problem rather than coming in and saying, hey, we're human, we want to sit down and have a conversation. And getting people there. If you pull somebody for a traffic citation, pull into a school parking lot and do the paperwork. There's all kinds of no to low cost mitigation ideas to getting them in and teaching people how to do this. Part of it was helping businesses understand how they can help in the public awareness campaign. So we went with Walgreens, headquartered in the county. They started handing out Gear Up, Get Ready information when you go to pick up your prescriptions at all their stores in and around the area. And they're willing to do this for free. They're willing to go out and do things. So there's ideas of meeting with big business to help them and getting them involved. Obviously, they can't take your government packaged information. Sometimes they have greater authorities inside their own company. They may tweak some things to be more in line with their company policies and the image that they want to portray as a company, but they can get the general message across. Recovery and redevelopment planning. Some of these companies, they want to know, all right, if I've got 10,000 employees in Tacoma or wherever else, what's the housing situation? Can we get involved? Can we support your recovery housing plans? And what does recovery plan mean anyway? Is that recovery administration? Is that long-term community recovery? Is that community redevelopment and resilience planning? Is that housing? What does that mean? Where do they fit in? But they also want to know, in some cases, would private business get involved to say, here's what we would prefer if all the housing is taken out in a particular area. These are the things that we would need and how many people that we would actually need to house in these areas. And then FEMA has policies of saying, well, we can't set up group sites, group home sites necessarily on private property, but what's the right mix? How can we do that to get people back in? And then actually starting to design a new normal. The thing that bugs me about the terminology that we use in emergency management is rebuilding to a pre-disaster condition. I think FEMA's making great strides at, with the Sandy Recovery Improvement Act of trying to say, how do we do alternate programs and making it more efficient? Because if something in the business community didn't work before the earthquake, then why are we rebuilding it to the same standard? Let's go back and take a look at how we actually improve. And then develop effective pre-event contracts designed to supplement your capability. Vendor managed concepts. Control your own destiny. When I was in my office in Alabama, we basically signed, we secured our own warehouse. What kept me up at night was not being able to run water ice and MREs for the first 48 hours after a major event. I didn't want to be completely dependent on the national logistics strategy at the time. I wanted to be able to control my own destiny for the first 48 and then have the federal government backfill, my capability and fill up the pipeline. What I needed was a grant to buy the warehouse. I called Liddsey Water. They signed an agreement with the state of Alabama and say, we'll keep 100 truckloads of water in your warehouse and we'll run it for daily distribution as it's our private business. They're basically just use the facility so that the water never expires. You know, it never expires. It goes on their shelves. They sell it. And the bottom line is that we signed an MOU that if we got hit by the hurricane, we would buy truckloads of water at the market rate, which was like $10,000 to $12,000 per truckload. And at least I had the first 48 hours of water in the state, and I wasn't dependent on it coming from somewhere else. So where do you line up no-cost pre-event contracts? Not just there, but maybe recovery management. If City of Seattle gets hit, you're not going to have enough recovery staff to manage all of the funding that's coming to you. And eventually you're going to have to go back to your day job. In some cases, billions of dollars, not, you know, to some degree, can occur in some of the major cities. And, you know, look at your staff. Are you staffed up to properly manage that for every county department or city department that's a part of your EOP or not? And teaching them how to do it. So what happens when the private sector is responsible? This was BP Deepwater Horizon. What was going on this day? When that explosion occurred, Albertville, Alabama had been hit by a tornado. So I was getting on a plane with the governor to go to Albertville. I get a phone call from Jim, from our friend Mark Cooper, who is the Louisiana emergency manager for the state of Louisiana. And he says, "Hey, Brock, there's this big oil rig that just exploded out in the Gulf." And I said, "Mark, I can't talk about it right now. I got to go clean up the tornado. Something else is wrong in Louisiana." You know, click, and then we go. And come to find out, at the time we had gone through a staff reduction, 15% budget cut. I normally would have 150 staff positions. I was down to 97. So my guys are running full-blown on a tornado disaster. This starts to occur. The next day, Coast Guard comes in and starts briefing us on the ramifications of this. And that started a 78-day activation. So it was like that movie Groundhog Day, and every day was the same. I'd wake up and every day was the same for 78 days. But the bottom line is that when, you know, the disaster world is trying to tell you guys something. So you've had the West Texas explosion. You've had, you know, we've had H1N1. We're going through avian bird flu now. There are all these other events that are non-Stafford Act. When FEMA's not in charge, and it's another government agency that is, or the private sector is responsible, as the OPA Act of 1990 established as a result of Exxon Valdez, it's a completely different ballgame, and it's not traditional to the way that we train emergency managers on how to handle big disasters. First of all, we were never operating with clear visibility as to how the magnitude of the event, because the private sector was keeping that information. And it started out on April 24th as it's just leaking 1,000 barrels a day, to June, it's leaking 53,000 barrels per day, to I don't care what it's leaking at this point. It's bad. Okay. The other thing is that this was a bad event, right? I mean, did any of you guys work that up there? This was a bad event. The problem is that the legislation, the OPA Act of 1990, was formed around that event, and it's not designed to handle deep water. And then we just have another oil spill off the coast of California, right? Did we go back and change OPA Act of 1990 based on Deepwater Horizon? No, we didn't. Did we learn that the private sector was completely self-sufficient and able to clean up the disaster in BP Deepwater Horizon? No, we didn't. Did we go back and do anything, or did we sweep it under the rug and declare success? You know, so largely, the math, somebody did the math, it was like 4.9 million barrels. I don't put any accuracy in this, but basically the amount of oil that was spilled could fill up basically 2.5 million Chevy Tahoes with 30-gallon gas tanks. You know, that's basically what was put out there. So the impacts Alabama, and this is Alabama snow, by the way. It's a fine grain. It's a big grain sand that's pulled out, it's pumped out of the Gulf and put on the coast. That beach right there produced 16% of the sales tax revenue for the state. Okay, we don't do casinos in Alabama like Mississippi had or Louisiana had. A lot of the impact of Louisiana was in the wetlands, beautiful wetland areas, but not in areas that generated massive amounts of sales tax revenue. In Mississippi, most of the casinos that are on the coast rather than on the beach and their man-made beaches. But in Alabama, it's all Beach, and that's what we depended on. And it hit right at the beginning of the season, and it was intermittent. Some days it looked like this, but it was swamped with BP volunteers, okay? Because they're trying to put out their best foot forward. They were in charge. And then what happens is public health comes in, and they have a lot of power. They come in and they ban swimming advisories from June 1 to July 30. Well, there goes the summer revenue. The tourist dollar was out. You know, the seafood industry was completely shut down. You know, almost $500 million worth of loss in the seafood industry. And what's interesting is there are stories about the impact to private business here. It wasn't just what was on the coast, but there were accounting firms that handled the accounts of these seafood firms that lived in New York or Chicago or whatever else. But they're not eligible for the disaster assistance and the penalty funding from BP because they weren't within 10 or 50 miles of coastline. You know, or the gas stations that went out of business along I-65 because nobody came that summer to get gas. You know, as they were coming down, and they depended on a lot of that. Offshore drilling support was also shut down. So, you know, government's reaction to this is, well, we're going to shut this all down until we figure out if this is regulated right. Well, when they did that, they killed another 10 to 12,000 jobs of all the people that work on oil rigs in the Gulf every day. On the ones that were abiding by the rules. So it was just kind of a knee-jerk reaction of we're going to shut the whole thing down. And it just kept cascading and cascading and getting worse. And it's completely different. When you frame this response, it was completely different. So over here, you know, the governor's really involved in the emergency declaration process. And then typically the state director is, you know, the governor's authorized representative. I served as the governor's authorized representative to FEMA several times. And then we go into this nice little system. Well, when FEMA's put in a box, and it's you know, an event of national significance, this whole national contingency plan takes over. And what happened was that you had a national incident command system, unified area command, and then you had unified incident command set up in these locations. Mobile, Alabama, unified incident command was 4,000 people. 4,000, and they wanted one state rep from the state of Alabama. Okay, 4,000 people. Largest incident command event in the country's history. Private sector, gobs of people. And somewhere down here came to the local governments. What's your priority? So it was pretty interesting. So multi-area agency unified command. You know, some of the lessons learned. Chain of command didn't exist. I actually had to turn BP into our biggest asset to do the oil fight and the response and the public awareness and the outreach. So it was, look, we're all in this together. I know you don't want to be here, BP, and we don't want to be here either, but what I couldn't get from the Coast Guard, I would turn to BP and get it. And a lot of times I ended up turning to BP because there were too many chickens in the chicken coop. And largely looking over too many states, and I finally just said, I'm not getting what I need from Homeland Security, so let's turn BP into our friend. And they started offering up. It was the craziest meeting I've ever had in my life. A guy named Chris Sliger says, I want to give you $25 million at our lunch. And he does it on the back of a napkin. I said, wait a minute, I can't take that. Let me ask if I can take that. I call my attorney. State says, yep, we can take it. And then it assumes all government accounting rules. Government can take money from the private sector when it comes to a response. And then it ended up being hundreds of millions of dollars that we ended up using and buying equipment, oil fighting equipment that was outside of the area contingency plan. And the area contingency plan that was implemented for this was basically a plan without no means. It was pretty worthless in my opinion. A lot of times, you know, the state and local priorities were completely left out of the national contingency plan chain of command. And it became going back to BP saying, I need this, I need that, can you help? And then they were funding it and doing it. It wasn't perfect. You know, the frustration piece of this was BP and the oil and gas industry or the private industry is not set up to do community relations and individual assistance. So you've had thousands and thousands of people impacted by this, but what system do they register in that BP had ready to go and say, oh, we had an oil spill, you know, the disaster hotline is open, call in, you know, here it is, we're going to give you funding, we're going to refund your business. And, you know, I had made, you know, multiple pleas to FEMA to say, wait a minute, or Homeland Security and Janet Platano, wait, you know, under your umbrella of all these agencies in Homeland Security, FEMA could really play a great community relations role and help BP start to establish that system to get them in. The problem is the time frame that it took for any assistance from BP to go to those businesses was forever. So how many businesses died? So you've got all this money, $1 billion, sitting in the old Spill Act 1990 trust fund or whatever, waiting to be used. We used it to pay for the federal government's response. We didn't use it to keep the doors open of the businesses that were hemorrhaging, they couldn't help themselves through this situation. And government and private sector are duking it out as to how this should work. There was no system in place. And I bet if you call Ryan Brockenbrand down in California, he found out the same thing. Okay? Anyway, actually, and when it came to local emergency managers being included in that whole process, we actually had BP rent out the hotel across the street from where Incident Command was, and we set up a forward operations center because I didn't have anybody left. They were either fighting a tornado or out down on the ground in Alabama. We didn't have anybody in our, we didn't have anybody left to basically do the fight up there, and they actually paid to transform a hotel lobby into our city emergency operations center to run everything down there and set it up and they outfitted it. Let's keep going because I'm down to about 5 minutes. Some of the other things that were there. The media is just as responsible as BP for the amount of damage that was done to the economy. Okay? They would take NOAA's oil plume models and not know what they were talking about. They would do things like, oh man, you know, forecast looking bad. There's going to be crashing waves of oil on the Alabama coast. And what did people do? They checked out of their hotels, they canceled, they went to the other coast of Florida, or they went to the East Coast or wherever to go to vacation. And errant reporting like that killed us. What should have been done on the public awareness campaign was, if you want to help this national crisis, please don't check out and cancel your vacation. Eat in the hotels, play in the theme parks, do the things you would normally do. You just can't swim. Please come down and help out so that these businesses thrive and survive. But that message never got put out. And in retrospect, that's probably the only way, you know, that we could have done it, because everybody wanted to come volunteer to help out, but who's trained to do hazmat and clean oil off the beach? Nobody. And to do it rapidly was not good either. So, you know, the bottom line is, now, this is the slide I was talking to you about, Jim. Somebody put it together. It probably took 2 weeks. This is just Florida after BP Deepwater Horizon. This is the penalty fund. This is the fund from the government. This is all the money that's coming down. This is the National Recovery Disaster Act funding for every dead turtle and everything else they killed, fish, whatever died. You have no idea. Florida's getting ready to receive $4 billion. How many years after the disaster? It still hadn't hit. Alabama still hadn't gotten their money. So what good is all that money going to do now, in my opinion? Look how long the lag time is. And we still have not gone back and said, all right, who gets to manage this? $4 billion. You're going to look like a deer in headlights, you know, when you get it. Congratulations, Chandra. There's $4 billion. You're new in office, but the penalty money has finally come due. Go fix this, right the wrongs with this money. Moving forward, you know, I guess we could go there. I'm going to stop there. This is me. I think there's great, you know, there are great things that are happening in the public-private sector partnership. I think there's a tremendous amount of room to continue to grow it, and we got some real problems to solve in the data sharing and compatibility capabilities and everything else. I'm open for questions. All right. None. All right.
What happened to your warehouse? Tell me about your warehouse.
The governor fought an illegal gambling casino war and shoved it full of slot machines. And the FBI took it over. The Senate approved gambling. 11 of them got arrested by the FBI right after they voted. So vote buying scheme, there's all kinds of stuff.
And you didn't have the water.
I didn't need the water, but the concept is there. The concept is there. Yeah.
You know, I'm reminded of something that happened about, it was after Top Off, and I was asked to talk about this, and one of the slides I came up with was, you know, everyone talks about $50 million disasters, and that's a big deal too, you know, if you're in a place like Seattle. And I said, you know, why don't they just give us 10 million now, and let us distribute it as we need it, and then over time let your team of 75 accountants come in, and we'll fight for the rest of it. But just to get some money up front, immediate cash, is a big deal, just for the government and also for the people that whose businesses you're trying to keep open. And I think the slide was called "Take Thy Pen and Write 20% of the check." You know it's going to be. You know it's. You don't have to have but they had to wait till the exact amount. And the last day I was in Seattle, after we were doing a Nisqually earthquake walkthrough, and there were 44 people in a meeting for 2 hours, just describing what they were going to do the next week when they came to meet. It was a pre-meeting. And I calculated that meeting cost $27,000 just to sit there in the room. So there are some lessons that need to be relearned and some that need to be advanced a little faster.
I think that everybody in this business, whether you're with FEMA, I got deep respect for the people at FEMA. I have deep respect at the state level. I have greater respect for those at the local level. The private sector obviously plays a major role. I think everybody does what they think is right for each one of these disasters. It may work sometimes and it might not. I just think that we don't do a good job sometimes of actually analyzing what's working and what's not. And you see a, quote, best practice take off of saying, well, we need a business EOC. And then every state goes, yep, we're going to do that, we're going to emulate that. I don't like the term best practice. I think it's a bad use of two words put together in the English language. There's always emerging practices based on the type of offense that we go through. Best practices grow old and antiquated, and in some cases they start to change. And at what point does somebody recognize and say, whoa, I know you're up there promoting business EOCs, but it's time to go to a virtual platform and vetting these speakers before they go to conferences and making sure that what they're saying is still applicable as the best practice.
Well, and not only that, there's a lot of angst over the argument that we were going to do something different in the state of Washington. We started in 2006 working on this. The business EOC really emerged after that. And frankly, a lot of it was based on Wendy's advice to me that a lot of these businesses cannot put someone in our EOC. And my perception that when there is an extra layer of reporting, they're going to be feeding the feds, and all of a sudden we've got an extra stop on the way to get information. And we saw even during the post 9/11 era how many silly reports we had to answer because somebody wanted to know how many 16-year-olds were involved in that event or something like that. And that happened. And so it seems to me that you're on the right track. It's just a matter of how we pull these folks together and go forward.
I don't know, I see a lot of planning assumptions that I think are just not right. And that's what's interesting about the private sector. I mean, I travel all over this country and work with different emergency managers all over the place. And if there's something I see, you know, I latch onto it and study it to make sure it's right. And then there's things that you just sit there and say, you know, we'll develop the plan, but I really don't think that your assumption is correct. And again, going this direction, and they tell you either to get out the door, shut up, or just write the plan, and you say, okay, fine, I'll do it. You know, but you know, it's like mass evacuation. I do a whole thing on mass evacuation. It's the dumbest thing we do in emergency management. You know, if you look at the behavioral science behind those that died in Katrina, or the 1,400 deaths inside Katrina, if the Knight Ritter report that was done, 85% of those deaths were over the age of 50. No one's going to tell you. Your widowed grandmother and the aging Americans are not going to get on your bus, plane, or train out of town for the next storm either. And they didn't for Katrina. They need an area in the French Quarter that they can walk to that didn't flood. And when they do it, they need senior safe center and senior, you know, help group connections to get people to go 5 miles, not tens of miles. And I don't believe after the big earthquake that everybody's just going to leave Seattle or Memphis or wherever and go other places. No, they're going to want to stick around, and they're prideful about living here, and that, you know, this is their essence, you know, their culture, and we're going to rebuild. And, you know, and you're, you know, in these plans of saying, well, we're going to have to bus all these people to other areas. It's not realistic. It's not going to happen. I've never seen anybody leave Podunk, Alabama after the 80% of the infrastructure is gone in a tornado. They come back in and rebuild. It's interesting. A lot. Anyway, I wish I had about 24 more hours. I could sit and talk your head off.
No problem.
Thank you, guys. Thank you very much.
Brock, on behalf of the Homeland Security Emergency Management Center of Excellence, we thank you today for sharing your wonderful expertise and knowledge and providing a really thought-provoking session for all of us today.
Thank you,
so
Whitney.
much.
I appreciate it.
Thanks
Thank
so
you for
much.
letting me be here. All right.